There is a familiar story recorded in all three of the Synoptic Gospels in which Jesus asks the disciples a pair of penetrating questions. The first question is objective. Who do people say that I am? And they give a variety of answers based on what they've heard. Then Jesus asks, but who do you say that I am? This is a personal, subjective answer. Not that the identity of Jesus is subjective, but that our answer is by nature subjective. Peter answers, perhaps for the whole group and perhaps just for himself, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Every individual Christian and every Christian church has to answer this question. We all alike have good answers, but we all answer somewhat differently, each of us emphasizing one quality of Jesus or another. All are true pictures of Jesus, and yet all alike are somewhat distorted by our own perspectives. All this week, I'm looking at different ways different parts of the church picture Jesus. From strict lawgiver who demands complete and total obedience, to sweet Jesus who loves the little children, there are several relatively distinct portraits of Jesus that different wings of the church gravitate toward. Today we'll look at a very familiar portrait of Jesus, Jesus as lawgiver who is also mediator between humankind and God. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Friday, April 19th, 2024. H. Richard Niebuhr's book, Christ and Culture, written nearly 75 years ago, has remained in print ever since its first publication. That alone is testament to its ongoing influence, especially in the scholarly community. It is simply one of those books that, agree or disagree with Niebuhr's methods or conclusions, you just have to wrestle with. His premise is that there are 5 typical ways Christians and Christian communities have answered the question of the relationship between Christ and culture, between Jesus, Son of the living God, and the world we human beings actually live in. How are we Christians to live between these two monolithic realities? There is an undeniable tension between these two realities, and there are different ways of resolving, or at least living within, this tension. And each one of these typical answers envisions Jesus somewhat differently. Some of these portraits are very familiar, others very different. Between the two extreme answers, Paul sees 3 typical answers that have been adopted in one form or another by most of the church throughout history. So one of the words I use to describe good theology is that it always involves the recognition of certain tensions, polarities, even seeming contradictions, and the best theology does not attempt to resolve these polarities on one side or the other. No theology gets it right all the time, but I always gravitate toward those theologians who embrace the tensions and polarities. Indeed, one of the typical portraits of Jesus that Niebuhr identifies is held by what he calls Christ and culture in paradox. For him, the Apostle Paul and Martin Luther are the 2 great examples of how this particular dynamic works, and their portraits of Jesus include seemingly contradictory elements. Like the radical Christians who see separation from society as the only viable way to live out the Christian life, Paul and Luther see Jesus as a great lawgiver. But unlike the radical Christians, they also understand him to be the great mediator between God and humankind, whose perfect obedience to the law bridges the divine-human divide and enables us to be reconciled to God, not because of our obedience to the law, but because of Christ's obedience. Paul's picture of Jesus in Romans is an excellent example of this portrait. Paul writes, "Therefore, since we are justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have obtained access to this grace in which we stand. And we boast in our hope of sharing the glory of God." He continues, "God proves his love for us, in that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. Much more surely then, now that we have been justified by his blood, we will be saved through him from the wrath of God. For if, while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more surely, having been reconciled, we will be saved by his life. If all this sounds familiar, again, it is because this is exactly the kind of portrait of Jesus you have heard preached in most mainline Protestant churches. But is this the whole picture? Is this portrait of Jesus complete just because it sounds familiar? No. There are other facets of Jesus than this one neglects. Yes, he is the mediator through whom we have reconciliation with God, but he is also our teacher who shows us what true human life lived in communion with God looks like. And, so far, in none of the portraits have we explicitly seen the love of Christ enacted. For that, we'll take a look at the fifth and final portrait of Jesus tomorrow. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.